Everybody ready? Okay.
Okay.
Perfect. Thanks for coming. This is the third session we're organizing, and if you've been to any of the ones before, we're going to talk very generally, theoretically, practically, design-wise about our main question, which is how do we design online learning environments? And our initial impetus was, let's step back, think about all the components that go into it, and we invite experts who provide great insight and advice on what kind of things should be thought of as we're doing online learning environments. We're not providing a packaged solution to anybody, but we are providing a lot of thinking points. So that's the general idea, and we realize that many people who come are actually interested in this issue. So do please contribute with questions, comments, and anything you'd like to say. So our guests always ask me, what am I going to talk about? They're all very experienced in their respective fields, and I'll try and engage a conversation to address these. First of all, what we should do though is go around with our speakers and have them introduce themselves to us very briefly and tell us a little bit about their background, where they are in UVA, and who they are, so we can then start the conversation. We can start with Dr. Coan.
Okay. My name is Jim Coan. I'm in the Department of Psychology, and I study the sort of biology of social relationships and social communication and emotion.
I'm Bill Ferster. I'm with two groups. I'm with the Curry School of Education and also with a group called Shanti, which is Science and Humanities Arts Network Technology Initiative. My interest in online learning is I've been working for the last year or so with Jenner and another professor at Curry, Mabel Kinsey, in developing an online forum tool, essentially looking at online forums and trying to find an alternative way, or at least a better way of doing online forums than the traditional threaded discussion.
What Bill isn't saying is that he has a much longer experience designing for the web and other industries. So he has done a lot of designs, and mainly for learning as well. He has a general interest in history and learning and social studies too, so very multifaceted background.
So I'm Kristin, and then I'm in the umbrella of IT, and I'm in charge of the MOOC experiment that we're currently conducting. So we can answer questions about that. My background is I did my grad work in online learning, but then I've managed enterprise IT projects for the last 17 years. So when this came down the pipe and it needs a way to actually deliver something that they're talking about, here I am.
I'm Diane Hoffman. I'm on the faculty at the Curry School of Education. I teach in the Social Foundations program, anthropology of education and international comparative education. And I'm a real novice in this field of online learning, but I've been trying to implement some online learning with a cohort of students who are attending a university in Haiti and partnering my Haitian students with my students in the course at Curry School, UVA, this semester. So it's been a learning experience.
Yeah, well, thank you. And as you realize, the same happens to me when people say their backgrounds. I'm like, exactly. This is the kind of people we want to have all in one room so we can talk about this specific issue. And our issue right now is communities, which I think is one of the biggest pain points when we're creating any online learning environment, because one of the first things people say, either teachers say, I can't get to know my students, or the students say, I don't feel like I belong to that classroom. Now there are MOOCs, so 100,000 people, then okay, how are we going to manage it and tackle these tasks? One thing that is clear is that we have to find a solution to this problem. So let's start from the general and theoretical, and I want to start with Dr. Coan, and then we can go to Dr. Hoffman and ask, what is community, but what are the main elements that should be there for you to be able to call something a community?
So in my work, I view relationships as kind of networks of interdependence, distributed effort. So one of the things we're finding in terms of the design of the brain, especially the human brain, is that it's really set up to share goals with other human brains and engage in joint attention with other human brains. And there's a lot that follows from that. What that means is that as we share a focus of attention and share a goal, we start distributing how we process information regarding that goal and that object of attention. And then we, perforce, start becoming interdependent. We start, this is, that's very abstract. This is easiest to understand at the level of what we call social affect regulation. So one of the big problems in the world, especially over evolutionary time, is how you deal with anticipatory anxiety. Anticipatory anxiety is something that we feel as unpleasant, but what it indicates is vigilance processing by our prefrontal cortex. We have to be vigilant because the world is really, really scary and dangerous, and it actually is those things. And our prefrontal cortex is costly. So one of the things is when you have to be vigilant for long periods of time, you have to regulate your own behavior. If you want to run away, but it's not a good idea, then you have to regulate your impulse to run away. That's also prefrontally mediated. And prefrontal cortex processing causes you to become exhausted. And as you use it a lot, you steadily decrease your ability to use it. And humans have this very wonderful adaptation, which is to share prefrontal processing across social networks. Again, pretty abstract. I'm trying to make it as concrete as possible, but the bottom line for me is that communities are best conceptualized in a way that a lot of sociologists refer to as sort of social capital. They are interdependent groups of shared resources that share goals, share intentions, understand each other's minds, and behave interactively. Sorry if that's too technical.
Oh no, that's perfect actually, and it links back to a lot of the things we're going to talk about. Like I would like to ask Dr. Hoffman, we talked about anticipatory anxiety. Does that happen in a classroom?
Definitely. Especially for a person who's somewhat in a position of responsibility for guiding others, but sometimes it feels more like we're blind leading the blind. So it's definitely a sense where anything could happen, and you feel somewhat unprepared for the kinds of questions that are going to arise. But the other side, the flip side of that, is that it really encourages a kind of mental frame of openness to possibilities and learning from mistakes, and so that to me is an important part of it. As you were talking, I was thinking also of the issues that arise when we think about community in international and cross-cultural terms, because we all bring certain assumptions to that process, of certain ideas of what community is, which may not be the same ideas that one would find in a cross-cultural kind of setting. So people who have different cultural backgrounds coming together to create community often face some additional kinds of issues related to cross-cultural communication, which I've been also dealing with in my experiences this semester.
So generally when we're talking about cross-cultural, it doesn't have to be always like in completely different countries. Even the United States has very different formations.
Even it doesn't have to be international, it could be just right in our own backyard.
Exactly. So one of the questions then is, okay, so there is going to be this anxiety, this problem. How do people solve it, Dr. Coan? So let's say we enter a classroom, we're completely new there. Let's talk about a physical classroom for the moment. What are the ways a person could deal with that?
We're finding that within less than 200 milliseconds, okay, that's a fifth of a second between following the time that you meet someone new, you start assessing them for whether they're going to be friend or foe. I mean, it happens so lightning fast that it's really a part of the way that our brain is built. The good news is that it looks like our brain assumes friend first. It really does, and it's too fast to really be taking a lot of complexity into account. So you're seeing whether the person is looking at you, whether there's any kind of sort of smiling going on, whether all, there's all these kinds of things that go on. People start forming alliances right away. When you, so what helps that along, it turns out if you feel like you're understood, and understood can be very broad, meaning that if you feel like someone knows your political orientation, that's the broad version. The narrow version is if you feel like someone knows that you're interested in that object over there because you're looking at it and they look at it too. Little things like that start facilitating social cohesion, and it's very rapid because humans are like a hand trying to clap. We're always looking for the other hand, and we're always doing that with each other, and we have another part of our brain that's all sort of reflexively waiting to clap back. So we're really very, very prepared to set up community. So I think that's less of a challenge than doing things like overcoming perceptual barriers. So when there's physical distance, we have to add a layer of explicit knowledge about what social resources are available to us, and that's more effortful. So people tend to want to be together in each other's physical presence, and anyone will tell you that. Since a lot of this discussion for me mirrors a lot of conversations my colleagues and I have been having about social media, right? So you ask anybody, would you rather be completely out of contact with the people you love most or be able to contact them over Facebook? And everybody says, oh my God, Facebook. And then you say, well, what about in person with them or Facebook? And, oh, in person. And so there's sort of this hierarchy. But being in person really facilitates social closeness. And the more extreme form of that is touch. Touch is sort of a supercharged way, physical touch, sort of a supercharged way of generating relationships with other people. And there's an enormous amount of research on that now. On the teaching level, you probably know all about this, that in lots of experiments, even in other countries, and I don't know the other literature exhaustively, but you just have a teacher unobtrusively put a hand on the shoulder briefly, and students will often perform better for that teacher. It's subtle effects.
So would it be right for us to say there are immediate things that happen, biological maybe sometimes, and then there are long-term relationship building things that happen where people get more comfortable with each other?
Yeah, so in context matters a lot. So if you're under a lot of stress, and then the person that you're around puts a hand on the shoulder, communicates to you, they understand that you're under a lot of stress, then you'll bond very quickly. If everything's lovely and wonderful and you're sitting on the beach and they do all of those signals, then you might forget about them very shortly because it's not direly important. And that difference is a clue to why we evolved these strategies in the first place. It's a way humans have sort of learned iteratively to create little environments and take them with them that make us very strong in physical environments.
So if I ask you, if you get into an environment where the bandwidth is much more constricted, right now this is a very rich environment. We see each other. We all seem to be liking Justin Stablet there, or what have you, and sense these various things. So then we get into a situation in an online environment, like a Coursera course, or with your students in Haiti, where the bandwidth is much more limited. Do the same kind of psychological things apply? Do we still have that friend or foe within 200 milliseconds? And can we get the same kinds of things with a more limited connection?
I think you can get the same sort of things. I don't think but I'm guessing about that. I don't think we really know all that needs to be done in order to generate the kinds of relational processes that we're all designed to engage in through the network. I mean, I think there's some massive clues all sitting in front of us. We have Facebook. It's gotten really popular. We have, video conferencing with Google G-Chat or Skype or whatever it is now. And many people prefer that to typing their little chats. I think these are all clues that we want to see faces, we want to hear voices, we want to try and make it as real as possible.
I think that's exactly where we are anyway. So the questions we need to ask, we don't have answers to that, I think, is where we are. But then what we need to ask is, what kind of an environment is an online learning environment? How safe is it? How close it is? How important is the relationship that people have with each other? How dire it is? So these questions are the questions we're going to ask every single time we create a new environment, because every single one of them will be different.
But are we using the same? Are we using these new rules in the new media, or are we taking the same rules that he was describing earlier with the face-to-face ones, or is it some combination of both? That's the question in my mind right now.
And can we even tell, like, with new generations of kids who have a much bigger part of their life online, maybe there isn't as much a difference between Facebook and real life. Maybe there is. Like, this is all conjecture that we're thinking about, but interaction is changing.
Yeah, and in ways that are hard for me is to anticipate. So, and I have students that are interested in pursuing this because of the questions that we're interested in. But just as a personal anecdote, I was pretty, old man grumpus about Facebook for a long time because we're studying touch all the time, and Facebook and crap, and then had a baby, and one day I'm sick, wife is sick, baby's sick, and it's in the middle of the morning and we're all really sick, and I just put a little note on Facebook, we're all very sick. And the response was, I would have had to been on the phone all morning calling people to get the kind of response that I got. It was absolutely overwhelming. Mm-hmm. And that's almost a completely different, totally orthogonal kind of behavior. I mean, there's no precedent certainly in evolutionary times for typing help on a computer.
Yeah. So then when Bill said this is a richer environment, maybe that is a richer environment because of all the affordances that it provides.
It's hard to say. Yeah, it's different. I mean, like Twitter. Does everybody use Twitter here?
Well,
I came into it reluctantly, but I think I have once you filter out the right people to follow, you really do get a sense of certain communities. I follow the digital humanities communities and some of the other communities, and I feel that by following the appropriate people and constantly reading, I feel that I have a finger of the pulse that I would not get in any other way. And it's not a personal, but it is. It's an aggregated one.
Mm-hmm.
It's a different experience, but it's hard to argue whether it's richer or lesser. And whether the Facebook, like with Facebook, I took my birthday off of Facebook because I didn't like that thing where then all of a sudden everybody Facebook's only because they know it automatically. Screw you, put it on your calendar. Then you can tell me happy birthday. But I do like the other part where things happen and people, like, it's similar to what you described there.
Yeah, I think that happens automatically too. I do think that. I mean, people are so geared. By 18 months, little human children, do something that no other animal does, which is start getting freaked out if they can't help someone achieve a goal that they're watching, if they know how to do it. I mean, we're the only animal on Earth that responds that way. I mean, a little 18-month-old going, because they can see that someone's trying to open a cabinet and they know how to open it, and the other person doesn't. It's kind of miraculous in a way. So we're really primed and ready to create communities. So I think that's something that can work for us.
So, yeah.
I have a comment based when you were talking about, if you're in an urgent situation and you have the person on the shoulder, you can still connect versus if you're on the beach and you're relaxed. And I think, so in this MOOC experiment, I think, the whole idea of community it's a different paradigm. And I was explaining to Bill a story of a student that got a job because of something they had done in the class. And there's something to the, the ability of being in a community that gets you something instantly, that adds value to it in a way that I don't traditionally, maybe we do traditionally like that, I haven't researched it, but it's just a different, the value that you get of being part of that community. Not talking to what the actual interactions are of that community, but of being a member of that community.
So one of the things we can do is look at actual experiences that are happening, and which is one thing I would like us to get into. So Dr. Hoffman, you were talking about your experiment in Haiti, and I was wondering, like, how did that go? How did it start? Another example I know is, for instance, trying to unite students in Germany with students in the U.S., and the community is always a big problem. Getting people to talk to each other, to mingle. So how much face-to-face element did your program have, or is having, and how did the community form?
I'm sorry, what was the last question?
So how did the community form, and what is the face-to-face interaction versus online interaction that's happening?
Well, I suppose to start out, the idea of what I wanted to do in terms of interaction for the course was not what I ended up doing because of a number of technical difficulties that arose after we sort of got this thing underway. Namely, on the Haitian side, the students were supposed to have access to a computer lab where they would be able to, which they would be able to use regularly to interact with our students, but that so far has not happened. And so their computer connections were not good. And so I was in Haiti for 3 weeks in January to try to get this whole thing sort of going and off the ground. And then once I got there, I realized that the promised technology was not going to be there. And the students themselves don't have laptops. And so they're basically relying on what's available at the school where they are. And so that has been a huge hurdle. And so my initial plans for doing, using all the tools available, Blackboard, Collaborate, and all of that just fell through the cracks. So right now, some of the students are able to get onto the lab. We've been doing some kind of, but it's not face-to-face. And so it's more using email right now, and it's using occasionally discussion forums where topics can be posted and students can sort of reply, but there's not any real face-to-face kind of activity. And so, but that's not to say that this can't happen in the future, and that's my perspective right now, is that I'm just going to keep working with this as much as possible. And eventually, the Asian side may get their technology going, and we'll be able to do these kinds of things. And I think the students on both sides are really excited about it. So what I've done actually is create partner groups so that my student has a dedicated Asian partner, and so they can correspond with each other and from there create larger groups as their interests sort of evolve. So it's starting from one-to-one partners, and what I'm hoping is that maybe some partner groups will actually come together and they'll be able to communicate, whether it's just basically using email or other kinds of things like Skype or whatever, to eventually work together enough so that they can do some kind of project. That's the idea.
So that's very interesting to me, because our general idea is that if a student cannot get the 100% physical experience of being with another person, then somehow we're going to lose out from this community building. Like, I'm interacting with somebody who's somewhere far away. The least I could do is talk to them on the phone, hear their voice and intonations. But if I see them, that's better. If I see a wider context of where they are, like live and like with a wide angle, then that's even better. So I have more and more access to information about what is that environment, who is that person, what is the tone of the voice, what is the facial gesture. So the general idea, I think we can ask everybody here, is that is that making things significantly better, or can we have community development just by carefully building up structures where you write to yourself, and then we build trust and relationships in that way. So how much is technology an important component in here? Could we do it without? Could we do it with like pen pal style? So Kristin has done some MOOCs and some experience on that, and we'd like to hear from the research aspect of it too.
Well, I think the basis is the face-to-face community. I'm more interested in what technology. Are they on mobile devices? Are they the same age? Are they not the same age? But I think, at least in the massive setting, the localized communities form, personal communities form, and you'll find stories of people that come together for other communities that, when YouTube came off of China, and people would send the videos so that the student could stay on top of coursework. So I think those communities do form, and they do it virally, organically, through the networks, and they rely on things like email.
There's an example of it happening here, right? Can you tell us a bit about how that came to be?
What example?
The group was meeting at OpenGrounds.
Yeah, so there's, for the Go to Greatness class, it just wrapped, but there's a group that meets at OpenGrounds that participated in that class. And so there's also a Charlottesville meetup that happens every once in a while at Carrot Coffee.
So my question about that, it's a theoretical one, but it's like if we wanted to design a course and we said, oh, we're going to try to get people to form groups in real life.
We do that.
And so what kind of things, because somebody might have said that's never going to happen, although it organically happens.
I do think it organically happens, and I actually coach our professors that they shouldn't try to design it. Because, we're experimenting with it. We don't know. I mean, it's all an experiment. We have a range of people that haven't structured anything and then have provided a very scaffolded, precise structure. And we have pushback from the students on all ends of that spectrum. And I think, when you're in a massive situation, there's no way you're going to appease everyone. And so far, based on what other universities have done in our experience, it's better if it organically comes together and the groups self-form. And they do it on the discussion forums, posting things like, where are you from? And let's put together a study group. And they create stories where they can bond. You're like, I'm really into Angry Birds too. Let's put a study group together. Whatever.
Yeah, this happens spontaneously all
Right.
the time.
And so for us to try to organize that, there have been some, one professor wanted to do it by job, age, and location. HR professionals, no, you're not, no, and it's an experiment. We're learning as we go.
But so I'm wondering, Dr. Hoff, maybe you can help, and Dr. Coan too. So from actual learning experiences, what are the things we should tell them to share? Like, how should we actually do it? And the question should come maybe from how is it happening in real life? Like if you had a classroom and you wanted people to get along, what would you do?
Yeah, well, I actually started out with a couple of questions for them to answer and to share with them. So I had the U.S. students respond to a certain set of questions, and I also had the Haitian students respond to the same questions. So that they had some kind of initial platform to launch from and to continue their discussions. And most of the questions I started with were sort of, I would call them personal questions, but because sometimes sharing that personal information is a really good way to get people sort of in this mode of like, there's a real person on the other end of this exchange. And so we're not going to just start out with these kinds of intellectual debates, but we're going to start out from that was my initial kind of approach. But I'm also seeing now that the intellectual questions are also equally important, because sometimes people don't feel comfortable at that personal level, and they would prefer to start at a more sort of, what do you think of the political situation, or and sometimes that's equally important. So what it has shown me is that the basic listeners don't make assumptions, and so kind of step away from this and consider, that all the possibilities that you're bringing that might work in a given situation. Yeah.
So related to this, one of the things that come up always is the discussion of face and people seeing their faces, profile customization. Should we have profile pictures? Where should we have these pictures? And from a design perspective, our assumption is that we should have profile pictures wherever we can, so people just know, associate names. But I want to ask the panel, what do you think? Like from a psychology perspective, is there a lot of advantage to actually seeing faces? Because one thing I do know from my limited knowledge of psychology is that human brains are specifically designed to recognize faces. Actually, a lot of our effort goes into it. So how important is that kind of design elements in an online learning environment?
I think pretty important, but I don't want to overstate it in the sense that there's all kinds of evidence, as you all well know, that people spontaneously form groups almost with whatever substrate that's available to them. People just will start doing it. I mean, we all lived through the beginning of the internet and chat groups, with people pecking away at their computer keyboards at all hours of the night, talking about their favorite band or whatever it was, their football team. These things just happen. But I think you're right. I mean, the brain is prepared to respond to touch and faces and lots of things very, very rapidly and with more strength. I think that can facilitate, but it's not going to stop people from doing it if it's not available. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I mean, we're so bent on it that we'll find almost any way to do it if it's possible. Now, there are also these lovely social psychological experiments that have been done over decades. So we know really certainly that if we take people from radically different cultures potentially even, and we put them on the same team and put them under threat from the other team, that they reorganize their identities like that, lickety-split. They will, I'm, no longer, from Papua New Guinea and you're from New York. We're the blue team, and we're going to be against the orange team, and people will do that really, really rapidly. There's some suggestion that's debated about whether, there's some hint that genders can be, male, female can be somewhat resistant to that. I think men and women tend to sort pretty rapidly, and there's some resistance to unsorting that. But people unsort themselves in terms of race and background and stuff all the time, really, really quickly.
What is our experience in MOOCs? Somebody who has taken it, maybe we're organizing it, but when there's large groups of people, what would help the interaction? Would face help the interaction, or do we let people provide information about themselves that would build community? Because one of my concerns is that we're all business. Like, this is about the course, let's not mess around with anything else. This is the content, discuss the content and nothing else.
Well, I think it's a question of a series of cues. I mean, the face is, we're pretty well versed at looking at someone's face and getting some sense of who they are, really quickly. I don't know if it works out what the percentage of, just looking at someone's face compared to how accurate your assessment of that person is in reality. But I tend to think that I can look at anybody here and think, I kind of got an idea at some level, where you're at. So I think that it's one set of cues to go in there, and then that one builds on something else. Then all of a sudden the person says something, and you say, they actually, or they use a word that something or whatever. I personally think it's a series of little cues that you're building up this map of that person in your mind, and then he wears glasses, I wear glasses, or whatever these other kinds of affinities you were talking about go in, or affinities like he's talking about a particular topic that I'm interested in, or she says this, and then you build this layered map of this person, just like real life, I guess. I mean, maybe we're using the same tools that we use in person, but we don't get the sense of I can't go in and get a sense of physicality, but I get these other things, and they build a similar kind of map. Do you think it's a map that we build to people?
Yeah, I think that's a really good analogy. I mean, I think we should, I would just like to say at the outset, online interactions will never be as good as, digital will never be as good as analog. I'm just going to say that. I'm going to plant my flag there. It will never, ever, ever cross that line. Okay, so we're only ever going to be approximating. But I have a really good neurobiological explanation for why that is. And that is, I said earlier that the prefrontal cortex is expensive, and actually our brains try to avoid it, to avoid using it. That's why we take relaxing baths instead of sit there and go and calculate how awesome our life actually is, and that person didn't mean to say something mean to it. It's much easier to just go and have a drink, because you're not having to process information to do that. So there are actually experiments where you can say, on the one hand, we'll put everybody under threat of shock. This is partly what we do, right? So,
nice laugh.
yeah, right. And on the one hand, we'll have people hold hands while they're under threat of shock. On the other hand, we'll show people pictures of their loved ones, so you can actually look at the difference. Both people benefit from those interventions. So the people, there are circuits of the brain that are responsible for sort of generating negative emotions that interfere with your ability to think, right? And in both individuals, those circuits of the brain will be a little quieter. The person who's holding hands with someone and the person who's seeing a picture of a loved one. But there's a big difference. When you're holding hands, it's an unconditioned reinforcer. In other words, there's no conditioning necessary. It goes straight to very, very deep circuits of the brain that mean that you get the regulatory benefit without your prefrontal cortex. You're showing a picture, you have to decode it. It seems very subtle, but it's actually really important. The process of decoding the picture is what we all feel when we go, well, this is pretty good, but I'm looking at a picture. I'd much rather be in person. What we're experiencing subjectively is our prefrontal cortex having to go, that is a picture of my loved one, and I really love them, and so I feel a little bit better, but that's a picture. And so that encoding process means that it actually is kind of a self-regulatory process. It's not really social in the sense that touching is. We'll never, I don't know. There are people that argue we're going to be falling in love with robots, and AI is we're going to marry our computer, whatever. Maybe, but I
there's
have
remote touch
significant
with the
doubts.
sensors that get
There's the
triggered.
remote touch stuff now, and warm, and there's lots of things that people are trying to do to take advantage of that, but I have very serious doubts, especially anytime soon.
Right. There's this whole concept, I guess, of pre-attentive. Do they call it that in your field?
Pre-attentive?
Yeah. In visualization, there's a concept that.
Like primary consciousness or something?
Yeah, it's kind of like it hits you between your eyes. So when you're looking at two results, like this line goes up this way, this one goes up there. You look at it, damn, there's a crossover effect in this very quickly. Whereas if you actually have to read the numbers, it isn't pre-attentive, and you have to actually use your frontal cortex to figure. I assume your frontal cortex to actually interpret that and say, oh yeah, well these numbers are bigger than that one, as opposed to hitting you over the head with a baseball bat. And so in a sense, it sounds like what you're talking about. The direct stuff just comes at us without us having to think about it.
Anytime we can get something, whether it's knowledge, a coffee, a ride across town, anytime we can get something without having to try very hard, that's what we want to do. And that's what we should do. That's efficiency. Brains are trying to be efficient. And the reason that we're so social is that it's really efficient.
The problem, though, for anyone who has aspirations to improve online learning, so what we're basically saying is we really can't go to a certain extent.
I'm not saying that.
Don't believe it.
I'm not saying we can't improve on it. I mean, we're building, touch devices. I don't know what that's all about, but who knows? I mean, it's just.
One common element you both mentioned, though, is the efficiency aspect of it. And a lot of what we're doing, I think, in online learning is mostly text-heavy material. Basically, it requires a lot of analysis. Even something like a video, you can't skim, so maybe the lesson there is we should cater to the laziness and not necessarily try to ban it as something bad. Does that sound like, from a design perspective, Bill, or if you had to take this and build an online environment, what would you take away from this?
No, I mean, they're different. they're almost apples and oranges to some extent, because the sense of community is different from learning the content. The content is by definition, you're having to be cerebral about it, and be thoughtful, and think about thinking, those kinds of things. Whereas I think that goes, I think that goes with the territory of having to, having that transmission of content idea.
Mm-hmm.
But the other things I think that have to do with community, going back to that, I think I would disagree that we'll never, it's never going to be the same for sure. I mean, they're different. That's by definite. But I guess I would argue that there probably is some way that we can approximate it pretty close, and it's different, but it's good enough to have the same, that we can. I'm not sure what those particular things are, but that we'll be able to by throwing a bunch of smaller things together and building a model of what the experience should be, that we theoretically get enough of it so that if we're unable to meet in person, or may not, like you were talking a little bit earlier about anticipation and anxiety of people. Maybe the Haitian students have some anxiety as if they're having to deal with English-speaking American students, and in the sense, and I've noticed this with some cultures, that they enjoy being online and not having that anxiety. Some people don't like this, or like it sometimes, they don't like it other times, and so there may be some advantages. They're in class. I'm sure you've got some loud people that just constantly talking, saying, "Oh gosh, not interested in hearing more." But when there are other people that can't interject into the conversation, and in a sense, online maybe provides an opportunity for some of those people to find a way that's more comfortable with their internal being.
There's a lot of stories in the MOOC space about autistic kids, and this is such a great forum for, I should say autistic kids, anyone with autism. This is a great forum for them to get content and build community without that anticipation and stress.
So
yeah,
that's
it's really not about fostering laziness, it's about removing impediments.
Yeah.
Right.
I'm curious though about, in these online environments, how do you structure the online environment for good? So inevitably in social situations, you'll have the groups that bond together because they're like, that kids from out, they just moved here and they're like, you ostracize, you group together by ostracizing someone else.
One way.
One way. But so that happens online too. And so, we see that in the MOOC space of, okay, how are we going to handle the situation, and to what level do we intervene or not? And it's about, but I think it happens in all potential online environments. So how do you, any ideas on structuring environments to not have that?
I mean, as soon as they interdependently have to share a goal, they'll start forming a relationship. They almost can't avoid it.
So
Sharing a goal, but not having the same goal in a competitive sense, but having the same goal in a mutual gains kind of sense.
So that's theoretically sounds great, but I was wondering, in a classroom setting, because one would think that everybody in a class has the same goal, or maybe is that a competitive goal?
So I'm not being clear then. It's not that, because that can very rapidly become competitive. If they stand to gain from cooperation, they'll cooperate. It's just that over evolutionary time, most people in most communities stood to gain tremendously from cooperation, which is why we're such good cooperators.
So then one question, maybe Dr. Hoffman, you can answer this, is an educational setting a cooperative setting?
That's a really good question.
Yeah, so no, I'm just saying that, is an educational setting a cooperative setting by its nature, or does a teacher or a person has to make it that way?
That's an interesting question, because it raises, is learning always facilitated by cooperation, or is it facilitated by conflict also? And how do you balance, because inevitably you're going to have conflict and you're going to have cooperation. So those both, I would say that both of those can lead to learning. It doesn't have to always be just this kind of comfortable, cooperative kind of thing, but conflicts can also be a really interesting source of sort of destabilizing people's perspectives, and in that sense, through the destabilization, lead to greater learning. There's a whole lot of, some people who've done research on this talk about. So in each situation, you have an authority structure, and every time you have a learning situation, you do have some kind of authority structure. But what happens when you have an online environment and the authority is different, or it's not the same kind of authority that you're used to in your learning? And this is something really interesting in the Haitian case, because the authority environments in classrooms in Haiti have traditionally been extremely what we would call hierarchical or authoritarian. And so you take Haitian students who are used to perhaps always being told what to do, what to think, how to approach learning, and then throw them into an online environment where all of that is pretty much absent. So what happens in that situation? And it's been, and I don't know, because this is totally new, and so we don't know the answers to those questions. But what I've also been thinking about is, as you guys have been talking, is the important. Well, we often think of learning in terms of just sort of cognitive elements of this process, but the affective dimension is equally important. And so what I see happening is if there's going to be learning happening, it's the affective side of that is so critically important. And so it's sort of almost mediated through affect, and then the affect itself is mediated through the technology. And so that's a fascinating kind of question for me when I think about this, the outcomes of learning in an online environment. And perhaps we're going to be looking at new forms of affect, perhaps even through this technology. So to me, it's fascinating.
Yeah, and it's complicated because affect both facilitates and impedes learning.
It can, absolutely.
In different ways. The same
Facilitate
affect.
and can impede.
Yeah.
So to me, that's a really important dimension to think about. And also, from the perspective of a lot of anthropologists have talked about. And to me, this is, if I'm going to choose like a theoretical perspective to apply to this whole sort of online learning and community question, for me, it would have to be what anthropologists are calling situated learning, or situated learning in communities of practice. So what we're looking at in terms of online learning is the development of, when we say community, a community of practice. And each community of practice has its own rules, its own artifacts, its own kinds of things that it uses to mediate interactions. So in fact, we're looking at situated learning in a community of practice. So to me, that's kind of an interesting perspective to bring to the discussion.
And actually, community of practice, I find they actually do quite well in online learning environments because they are already motivated and they have a certain they share a background. So the affordances of online learning helps them immensely. And we find that some of the best MOOCs probably are the ones that already have this background of people who really want to learn whatever is being taught, have this strict motivation or maybe a background to really benefit from it. And then they will take the extra next steps to make sure that it happens. So that's a great point, I think, to end the panel part of our conversation. We still have about 10 minutes. And I know that a lot of you and your expertise will cover much more that we didn't even scratch the surface, like how could teachers behave, what kind of things we could design, what kind of technologies are available to us. So we can talk more about this later and share more of our opinions that way. But Before we all break, I want to ask some of our listeners to please chime in, either make a comment or ask anybody any issue that wasn't cleared up for you.
I have a comment that I'd be interested in your thoughts on how I might build on this. I've done a very preliminary review of student course evaluations for online courses in the Curry School, just to see, just from a very rough first pass, what sort of common themes I might see. And it seems that the students, the courses that are evaluated most positively are those where, even if they're fully online, the instructor has made some effort to either get face-to-face with the class or go to some extraordinary length to create a quasi-face-to-face experience. And so that seems, we need to study it more closely and see if that's really what's going on, or if I'm reading it, in a way that I shouldn't. But that seems to fit nicely with much of what you've already said. That would provide online courses some sort of a leg up, and maybe some proxies for face-to-face are better than others. I don't know.
Well, it's interesting, the studies of touch, teacher touching students on the shoulder and them performing better. Of course, the thing that's common to all those teachers, whether they're touching on the shoulder or not, is that they're all having face-to-face contact. There could be some analogous kind of effect here when we have online situations that, it would be really interesting not just to see the sort of Consumer Reports version of that, but see whether people actually perform in different ways, given those conditions.
One of the important aspects there, I think, is when you touch, we have to understand that students feel that there is some caring going on, and there are ways to do that without touching. One of the examples a colleague of mine was talking about, for instance, is one teacher's approach was to online mixed classroom is to have everybody introduce themselves, but completely forget that there's a bunch of other people joining in through through their own cameras, and their faces are nowhere to be seen, but they're there, and they kind of get skipped over. They don't have that experience of being included. So that what the teacher could do to include these people, but briefly saying that, you guys are not physically in here, but you are in this classroom, so why don't you make your presence? And noticing that is a way of teaching to say, I care about that segment of the group as well, to facilitate that.
And just would that kind of reaching out, with like emailing to the class, would that be considered one of the ways of making connection to the individual students from the instructor?
In one instance, a professor made the effort to drive to an off-ground site and have a meetup with the students. In another example, it was something like a Skype session where as many people could get face-to-face did. And I think others may have been where if maybe the course relied largely on a PowerPoint and audio format, that this person added a live chat also where everybody could get voices into the conversation. So off the top of my head, those are the ones that I'm recalling.
I think that's really interesting. I think it is about I'll call it virtual touch. I think it's about the engagement of the faculty member going beyond sort of what the students perceive the minimum requirements or the basic requirements of the course are, and that somehow or other they've made, through whatever that effort is, a personal email or whatever, that the faculty member at least cares about what the student learners do. I work in continuing education, particularly in the health professions, and what I find is that even in large courses, whether they're face-to-face or online or any of those things, it is about whether someone's willing to take that 2 minutes or 30 seconds to answer your specific question. Because the more you deal with adult learners, the more they have they come with an agenda. So they have their agenda, and part of the way they evaluate is whether they got their agenda met, not about whether it was the faculty member's agenda, but what the student's agenda was, the learner's agenda was. And I think, the further we get into this, what I think we're going to find is that it is going to be that those learner agendas are going to come much more to the forefront than they have in the more traditional environment. And we're going to have to figure out a way to deal with it.
That's great. Any other questions or concerns? You can also share experiences.
A short question about the rise, sort of looking at small groups, let's say.
could there be a potential problem with groups arising out of a larger group based on sort of shared either knowledge or background or whatever, so that then people end up seeking out people who are like them, which we all kind of tend to do. And then Jim, you said that kind of creating a shared goal for people might be a way to bring disparate people together. But I just wonder if you could reflect a little bit on that, whether in an online environment there's some possibility of bringing people who are different together to work together.
Well, I would just say that absolutely, and that's probably one of the greatest benefits is to bring people who have differences together. The shared goal issue is kind of interesting because I don't think of it in terms of one goal. There's always multiple layers of goals, so that there may be an ostensible goal that is either determined by the professor or maybe by the participants themselves. But there's always the hidden goals too. So, and those often they may not be voiced. They may be totally under the table. But nevertheless very important, so I think in terms of you. And sometimes those get revealed in those pointed comments to the professor, like, I need such, and so that's the real goal. And so there's just like this circus of goals there, kind of, and so, but it's not necessarily a bad thing, because in any situation people bring multiple levels of goals and a variety of things that they want to accomplish. And differences are to me a positive thing, and they can lead to really interesting exchanges. Because I've got students in this situation that have radically different life experiences. Like, I mean, there's a lot that's very, very different. And so far, from what I can tell, that's been a positive thing for them in their exchanges, because they get more exposure to alternatives than they've ever had previously, like different ways of thinking about basic questions like human relationships, or what's your relationship with your father or your mother or something like that. So to me, it's a very positive thing.
I guess one of the things that you haven't talked about, but it sort of relates to Jan's comment as well, is you have expectations, and we're creating, we have these different offerings online. We talked about having an online learning portfolio of different, you can have a tweet feed for your class, or you can go massively online, and there's hundreds of different, places in between. And I think the expectations of those communities, are you getting your personal goals met in a MOOC? Well, the professor's certainly not going to work with you one-on-one. That's free, like there's no credit, forget it. But if you're taking an 8-person online class and you're paying full credit for it,
Right.
your expectation is your needs are going to be met. And so I think there's a little bit of understanding what that range is, and that there are going to be different expectations for professor interaction or classroom interaction. But I totally agree that the diversity of it, and we talked earlier about it's all about business. It's all about the coursework, and I do think, at least with what we've seen, there's so much contributions in the discussion forums for the content of the course. I mean, that's why Coursera says, it's our intellectual property on the discussion boards. Yes, the videos and stuff, that's your intellectual property, but all of that content from the discussion forums is ours, because there's so much value that ends up getting added to the course that's built up by these different perspectives and world history. There's students in Taiwan that have a much better view of what happened in world history, or a very ethnocentric view of what happened versus our view of it. It augments the whole course curriculum to have those discussions. So I think the diversity is key, and it enhances the business of the course. But it's good.
Well, but don't you also think that with the world being what it is, and the amount of time that it takes for a piece of news to get from one place to another, and the amount of prefrontal cortex work that we're always having to do now to deal with the masses of information and the masses of data that are going on, that there is a space for these MOOCs in terms of learning and staying up to date and knowing what is going on that is in fact very different from an undergraduate or graduate course that is personalized and in very specific in meeting someone's degree requirements.
Well, I think there's a much more freedom to put your personal goal out to your class, just not the expectation that your professor's going
Right.
to show up and meet with you about it.
But I think if
So
someone
you can
walks
say-
into a MOOC,
so you say
they know that it's like 80, how many
Yeah,
ever
how many,
thousand
yes.
people are going to be on there,
We have
and
40,000
that they
students.
don't care that's not what their affiliation need for that particular content area or that particular activity is. That they're getting that through some other mechanism.
Or there's going to be somebody in the
Right.
80,000 person class that feels the same way, and they're going to, there's less risk of putting out there what they're thinking.
Right.
I do have one question about MOOCs. From some of the things that I've seen, so among the hundreds of thousands of people who register, and then all the attritions in terms of who does what, it seems like the community building tools or the discussions are the ones that the fewest percentage of people take advantage of over just viewing the lectures or doing the quizzes or doing the individual things. It's still a big number. I don't mean
No.
that's a
There's all
funny
kinds of statistics about if you watch the first video, your chances of actually completing the course, and if you watch the first video and you actually participate in a discussion group, your chances of finishing the course, and they're over 50% if you watch the first video and you participate in a discussion forum. It's just there's no cost for signing up, and so it's really easy to sign up, and there's never show up for any classes.
Yeah.
But if you participate in the community building tools, the chance that you'll finish the course are much higher.
But is it also true that the fewest number of people are participating in those discussions?
Yes,
Was
because it's the most
everything-
effort, right?
Yeah, I'm just curious, in terms of thinking about community and how some communities emerge organically and then some resist kind of the structural community that's been there, but then.
And it
people
depends on
come
your
into it
learning,
again,
right? So I've gotten addicted to the history course. I'm never taking a quiz. Like, I don't need the anxiety of not doing well on the quiz. I already did my work. I'm not doing it. I'm not gonna. So I won't complete the course. I'll watch all the videos. But it's like, it's not entertainment tonight. It's me actually learning about militarization, commercialization, the French Revolution, and
Yeah,
it's a better
but
perspective.
part of the thing is I've never seen one of these things in action. I have no idea on
just
some
like
level what
lectures.
any of us are even talking about. So
Sorry.
that's embarrassing to admit, but I have downloaded all of the behavioral ecology lectures by Robert Sapolsky at Stanford and watched them and enjoyed them immensely.
It's the exact same thing, only they chop it up in smaller bits, and in the middle of it, there's a little line comes up and says, now, we're talking about this. Right.
But I think one important question that comes out of this is while MOOCs can afford to not feel that everybody should participate in an educational setting, especially in K-12, we have to consider this. We have to say there must be some participation, and if community involvement improves that, and it looks like it does there too, so we have to more actively think how we're going to do that. So in higher education, other places where we actually want people to participate, we have to start thinking about these things and say, what is the community aspect of our tool, online tool, that is helping people to finish but cooperate and do things as well. So in MOOCs are one great example of how something should be done in learning environment, and they're amazing, they're doing great work, but one thing they always also say is that it's not the only way
And
to
it's
do
not
online
going to stay
learning.
that way, right? It's a new technology. It's going to be very different in 2 or 3 years.
Yeah,
And
it's
there
kind of
probably won't be
diversified.
MOOCs for K-12 for the most part.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't think there would be.
You think there would be?
So one good thing outcome of this, though, I hope we all got some thinking points about what kind of questions we should ask when we're going and developing our own online learning environments. We just skimmed the surface and didn't touch many of the very important things, but I personally got a lot to think about from this. So I would like to thank our panelists for participating and joining us. Give me a hand to clap. Or thumbs up if you liked it. So.
Well, I had a top shelf and everything, physical contact.
So we will have one more session about engineering specific issues coming up in April, and we'll send you an email about what that's going to be like very soon. So thank you very much for joining us, and I hope we'll see you next time.
Thanks, guys. That was fun.